The morning light fell softly through the kitchen window as Julia Sanders rinsed her coffee cup. The world outside was still waking up. The sound of birds, a dog barking in the distance, and the hum of a delivery truck somewhere down the street. Her days had all started like this since Emily, her only daughter, left for college. Quiet mornings, empty halls, and too much time to think. It had been a year since Julia's divorce from Mark. There hadn't been a dramatic ending, just a slow drifting apart. They had stopped laughing, stopped planning, and then, one day, stopped trying. Julia told herself she was fine. That solitude meant peace. But lately, even peace felt heavy. She buried herself in work, spending late hours at the small publishing office she managed. When she did come home, she often ate dinner standing at the kitchen counter, scrolling through old family photos. That Saturday morning, she was just finishing her coffee when the doorbell rang. She frowned. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened the door, she froze. Standing there was Ethan Miller, Emily's boyfriend. He was holding a box of pastries and a paper cup holder with 2 coffees. "Morning, Mrs. Sanders," he said, his tone polite but nervous. "I was just passing through and thought I'd stop by. Emily told me you've been working too hard." Julia blinked, trying to hide her surprise. She hadn't seen him since Emily left for school 2 months ago. He was tall, well-mannered, the kind of young man every mother hoped her daughter would meet. Grounded, kind, and steady. "That's thoughtful of you." "Ethan, come in before you freeze," she said. Stepping aside, he smiled gratefully and stepped inside, brushing snowflakes from his jacket. The air outside was sharp with winter's edge, but inside the home smelled faintly of cinnamon and coffee. Julia led him to the kitchen table where he placed the pastries. "These are from the new bakery on 5th, he said. "They're really good." Julia nodded, impressed. "You remembered I like almond croissants." Ethan grinned. "Emily always said they were your favorite." For a moment, the mention of her daughter filled the air with warmth. Julia missed Emily deeply, her laughter, her energy, her constant chatter. The house had grown too quiet since she left. And seeing Ethan somehow reminded her of those louder, livelier days. They sat with their coffee, talking easily about Emily's classes, the cold weather, and little things that filled the gaps in conversation. Ethan told her about his new internship at a construction firm and how hectic things had been. "You sound busy," Julia said. "I like it that way," he replied with a small shrug. "Keeps my mind steady." Julia smiled faintly. "You sound like me." The words came out before she could stop them, and she felt a strange sense of recognition between them. He gave her a thoughtful look, one that lingered just long enough to feel genuine. After a while, Julia noticed how at ease she felt talking to him. It wasn't awkward or forced, just calm. He didn't talk over her, didn't fill silences with noise. He listened. She hadn't realized how much she missed being listened to when Ethan finally stood to leave. The afternoon sun was glowing through the windows. "You should take some time for yourself," he said as he zipped his jacket. "Maybe go out with friends, travel a bit. Emily worries about you." Julia gave a soft laugh. "That sounds nice, but I wouldn't know where to start." "Start small," he said gently. "Maybe just start with taking a break." She smiled, a little touched by his sincerity. "Thank you, Ethan. You're kind to care." He hesitated at the door. "You deserve to be cared for, Mrs. Sanders." The word struck deeper than he probably intended. She opened her mouth to reply, but he was already halfway down the walkway, waving goodbye with that easy, boyish smile. That night, Julia sat alone at the dining table. The box of pastries sat beside her, half open. She took one and bit into it, sweet, soft, warm, and felt something she hadn't in a long time. Gratitude. Ethan hadn't done anything extraordinary, but his small act of thoughtfulness had chipped away at the cold walls she'd built around herself. She wasn't sure why it mattered, only that it did. For the first time in months, she didn't feel invisible. The days that followed carried that faint warmth with them. Julia returned to her usual work routine, but her mind wandered now and then to that short visit. That kind smile, that strange sense of being seen. It wasn't attraction. It was connection. She hadn't realized how much she needed one. A week later, she found a note in her mailbox. It was from Ethan. Just wanted to thank you again for the coffee and conversation. You've got a good heart, Mrs. Sanders. Don't let the quiet fool you. People notice. Hope the week treats you kindly. Julia read the note twice, smiling in spite of herself. She placed it in the drawer beside her desk and went back to her day, feeling lighter as the weeks passed. Small things began to change. Julia started waking up earlier, making real breakfasts again, even lighting candles at dinner. She reached out to an old friend for lunch, something she hadn't done in nearly a year. It wasn't because of Ethan, exactly. But his words had nudged something inside her, a reminder that life didn't stop, just because love once did. One cold afternoon, she found herself driving by the community park where she used to take Emily as a child. The trees were bare, but the benches were still there, scattered under soft patches of sunlight. She parked the car, got out, and walked slowly through the path. She hadn't done this in years. She sat on a bench, breathing in the crisp air. She thought about her marriage, the years spent trying to hold it together, and the quiet acceptance that followed when it ended. For the first time, she didn't feel bitter. She felt thankful that it had taught her strength, patience, and the courage to start again. Even if she didn't know where to begin. When she returned home, the answering machine was blinking. A voice message from Ethan played. Hey, Mrs. Sanders, hope you're doing okay. I'll be in town again this weekend. Thought I might stop by and help with those shelves you mentioned last time. Let me know if that's okay. Julia chuckled softly. She had mentioned those shelves in passing weeks ago. It was typical of him to remember. She hesitated for a moment, then picked up the phone and called back. Ethan, that would be nice. Saturday works. Great, he said cheerfully. I'll bring my toolbox. And coffee, of course. When she hung up, Julia stood quietly in her kitchen, the corners of her mouth lifting in a smile. It wasn't about Ethan. Not really. It was about what his presence represented. Life returning in small, careful steps. On Saturday, true to his word, he arrived early with coffee and tools. They worked together, laughing at their clumsy teamwork, and for the first time, the house felt alive again. The sunlight, the sound of their voices, the warmth of simple company, all of it reminded Julia that the world still had kindness left in it. When he finished fixing the shelf, Ethan brushed the dust off his hands. See? Good as new. Better, Julia said softly. Thank you, Ethan. He smiled, then looked at her with that same calm, genuine expression. You're easy to be around, Mrs. Sanders. It feels peaceful here. Julia felt something shift inside her again, not in a romantic way, but in a deeply human one. It had been so long since someone had made her home feel like a place of warmth instead of silence. That night, long after Ethan had left, Julia sat by the newly fixed shelf and looked at the framed photo of her family, Mark. Emily and her taken years ago. She whispered quietly, I'm okay. And for the first time, she truly believed it. She didn't know what the future would bring, whether Ethan would stay in her life or drift away like everyone else. But she knew that kindness had found its way back to her doorstep, just when she'd stopped expecting it. What she didn't know yet was that this simple connection, one built on compassion and timing, would change everything in ways she couldn't yet imagine. That realization, though faint, settled deep in her heart. And as she turned off the lights that night, Julia smiled in the quiet, because this time the quiet didn't feel empty anymore. Winter deepened quickly that year. The small town where Julia lived seemed wrapped in gray skies and quiet streets. Her days were steady work, coffee, home, but she felt lighter than before. Ethan had stopped by a few more times, always under the excuse of fixing something or dropping off something Emily had forgotten. Each time he came, the house filled with a kind of calm energy that Julia hadn't realized she'd missed. They talked about simple things, work, movies, books. Sometimes they didn't talk at all. They'd just sit with coffee, the sound of wind against the windows filling the silence. Julia appreciated that he never treated her like someone to be pitied. He spoke to her like a person, not a mother who'd been left behind by time. One Sunday afternoon, Julia was in her small garden, trimming dry branches, when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned and saw Ethan holding 2 paper cups. "Coffee delivery," he said with a grin. She laughed softly. "You're becoming dangerously good at remembering my favorite order," he said. "It's hard to forget something that makes someone smile." Julia felt her cheeks warm, though she brushed it off with a laugh. "Flattery? You're getting better at that, too," he chuckled. "Just honest observation." They sat on the porch, the winter air crisp around them. For a while, neither said much. The quiet was easy, comfortable. Then Ethan spoke softly. "I wanted to ask you something, Mrs. Saunders. Or maybe offer something?" Julia turned to him, curious. "Offer something?" He nodded slowly. "I know Emily's away most of the year, and you're here alone. I was thinking I could help out around here sometimes. I mean, only if you're okay with it. The place feels warm, and I like being here." Julia hesitated. She didn't want to read too much into his words, but his tone was sincere, almost protective. "Ethan, you already do enough. You have work, college, your own life." He smiled faintly. "I do, but this doesn't feel like work. Sometimes we meet people who make time slow down a bit, you know? It's peaceful here." Julia looked at him carefully. He wasn't flirting, at least not in the way men sometimes did. His words were genuine, almost boyishly honest. Still, something about his offer made her heart flutter with a mix of warmth and confusion. She nodded slowly. "If you really don't mind, I'd appreciate the help." "Then it's settled," he said, sipping his coffee. "I'll stop by when I can." And he did. Over the next few weeks, Ethan became a quiet presence in Julia's life. Sometimes he dropped in after work to shovel the snow off her driveway or bring groceries when he knew a storm was coming. Other times, he just stopped by to talk. They spoke about everything about her years as an editor, his plans for graduate school, and the strange ways people grow apart and come back together in life. Julia found herself opening up in ways she hadn't expected. She told him about her failed marriage, how she once dreamed of writing her own book, but never found the courage. "You still can," he said one evening, looking at her with quiet conviction. "It's not too late to start something new." His words echoed in her mind for days. That night, Julia sat at her desk and opened her laptop. The cursor blinked on a blank document. For the first time in years, she started typing. Just small things. A paragraph about her garden, a memory of Emily's laughter, a reflection on growing older and rediscovering joy. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. She began writing every evening after work. And slowly, the weight she'd carried for years began to lift. Ethan encouraged her without even realizing it. He reminded her that life didn't have to be paused after heartbreak, that it could bloom again, quietly, like spring under snow. One late afternoon, Ethan arrived as usual. But this time, something in his expression was different. He looked nervous, almost hesitant. "Everything okay?" Julia asked. He nodded. "Yeah, just. I wanted to tell you something. I got an offer, a big one." Her eyes brightened. "That's wonderful. For the internship." He nodded again, smiling faintly. "Yeah, but it's in Seattle. I'd have to move there next month." Julia froze for a moment. She didn't want to show how much the news stung. "That's great, Ethan. Really, you should go. It's a good opportunity." "I know," he said quietly, then looked at her. "But it means I won't be around much anymore." The words hung between them like cold air. Julia forced a smile. That's how life goes. People move on. It's part of growing. Ethan exhaled slowly, then said something that caught her off guard. "I don't want you to think I'm just leaving. You've helped me more than you know. You've been like family." Julia blinked, a lump forming in her throat. "Family?" she repeated softly. He nodded, his voice steady. "Yeah, you remind me of what home feels like." For a moment, she didn't know what to say. Her heart ached, not because she misunderstood him, but because she realized how much he meant to her, too. That evening, after he left, Julia stood by the window and watched the snow fall. She didn't cry, but her chest felt heavy. In a strange way, she had grown used to his presence. The laughter, the warmth, the small, thoughtful gestures that had brightened her days. The next few days passed quietly. Julia threw herself into work and her writing, but every time the doorbell rang, she caught herself hoping it was him. It rarely was. A week later, he texted her. "Can I stop by tomorrow? I'd like to see you before I leave." Julia replied simply, "Of course." When Ethan arrived the next evening, he brought a small, wrapped package. "Just something to remember me by," he said with a shy smile. Julia took the box carefully and opened it. Inside was a small silver pen with her initials engraved on it. "I thought you could use it for your writing," he said. "You once told me you never found the right pen." Julia's eyes softened. "It's beautiful, Ethan. Thank you." He shrugged lightly. "It's nothing big. Just a reminder that you shouldn't stop now. Keep writing. You've got a lot of stories left in you." She smiled gently. "You always say the right things," he chuckled. "Maybe because I mean them." They spent the next hour talking about his move, his plans, and the uncertain excitement of starting over. The air felt bittersweet, like a goodbye that neither wanted to say aloud when it was time for him to leave. He lingered by the door. "Promise me something," he said softly. "Anything. Don't go back to being alone. You have so much life left to live. Don't let silence take that from you again." Julia nodded slowly, her eyes glistening. "I promise." He smiled, that same warm, genuine smile that had brought light back into her home months ago. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out into the snowy night. Julia stood there long after he was gone. The silence in the house returned, but it didn't feel the same as before. It wasn't empty. It was full of memory, of kindness, of change. That night, she sat at her desk again. She opened her laptop and began typing, the new pen resting beside her. The story she wrote wasn't about love or loss. It was about rediscovery, about finding meaning in unexpected connections. And as the words filled the screen, she realized Ethan's visit had given her more than comfort. It had given her a reason to believe in life again. She didn't know if she'd see him again soon, but she knew one thing for sure. She would never forget how one person's simple kindness had awakened something in her heart that she thought was gone forever. The following morning, as sunlight spilled through the curtains, Julia whispered to herself, "It's not the end. It's just the next beginning." And deep down, she believed it. The winter passed quietly after Ethan left. Julia thought the silence in her house would swallow her again. But instead, it became something gentler, a silence that comforted her rather than hurt her. She had learned to live with it differently now. Every corner of her home still held traces of his presence. The small mug he always used, the jacket he forgot to take, the faint scent of pine he left behind. At first, Julia tried to keep busy. She poured herself into work, finishing projects earlier than expected. She spent evenings writing, filling page after page with thoughts and reflections she had buried for years. The more she wrote, the more she understood herself, her fears, her regrets, and the quiet strength she had gained through it all. One night, as she sat at her desk, typing with the silver pen beside her, a thought came to her mind. She wasn't lonely anymore. She missed Ethan, yes, but not with the same emptiness she once felt for the things she lost. He had reminded her what it felt like to be seen again, not as a mother, not as a woman past her prime, but as a human being capable of warmth, laughter, and new beginnings. Weeks turned into months. Spring began to creep into town, melting the last traces of snow. Julia's garden came back to life, and for the first time in years, she felt excited to see color bloom again. One morning, as she was tending to her tulips, her phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "Hi, Mrs. Sanders, it's Ethan. I hope I'm not disturbing you." Julia smiled instinctively. She hadn't realized how much she missed hearing from him until that moment. "You're not disturbing me," she replied. "How's Seattle?" They exchanged a few messages. Ethan told her about his internship, the challenges of the city. Now he missed the quiet mornings at her house, the coffee, the calm, the talks that always felt honest. Julia told him about her garden, her writing, and how she'd finally finished the first draft of her book. "You actually did it?" He texted, "I knew you would." "I did," she replied. "You inspired me." "Then it was worth everything," he wrote. Their conversations became more frequent. Sometimes a text, sometimes a phone call that lasted late into the night. They spoke about everything again, not as two people from different worlds, but as equals who had somehow changed each other's lives. Months later, Ethan mentioned he'd be visiting town for a few days. Julia felt a nervous excitement she hadn't felt in years, though she tried to play it off as simple happiness. She told herself she just wanted to thank him in person, nothing more. When the day arrived, the sun was bright, the air warm. Julia opened her front door to see him standing there. Taller somehow, more confident, but still with the same kind eyes. "Hi, Mrs. Sanders," he said with a smile that reached his eyes. "Julia," she corrected gently. "Call me Julia. You've earned that." He laughed softly. "Okay, Julia." They hugged, a simple, genuine embrace that said everything words couldn't. For a moment, time felt still. Inside, the house looked almost the same, though cleaner, lighter, filled with plants and soft colors. Ethan looked around and nodded. "You've been busy." "I have," she said proudly. "I've finished my manuscript." "Really? Can I see it?" She hesitated, then handed him a printed copy from the table. He skimmed a few pages, his smile widening. "Julia, this is beautiful. You wrote from the heart." "I wrote about life," she said softly. "About finding light when you least expect it." He looked at her meaningfully. "That's you, isn't it? The woman who learned to start again." She chuckled. "Maybe. Or maybe it's about someone who reminded her how." Their eyes met for a brief second, not with romance, but with something deeper. Gratitude, understanding, connection. That afternoon, they went for a walk through the small park near her home. The trees were blooming, the air smelled of earth and spring. People passed by with laughter and bicycles, but for Julia, everything slowed down. Ethan told her about his new project at work, how he was helping design a community center in Seattle. Julia listened intently, proud of how much he had grown. "I'm thinking of moving back here one day," he said suddenly. Julia raised an eyebrow. "Really? Why?" He smiled. "Seattle's great, but it doesn't feel like home. I miss the quiet. And—" He paused, searching for the right words. "There are people here who mean something to me." Julia smiled softly. "I'm sure they'll be happy to hear that." He looked at her with that familiar warmth. "You're one of them." Julia felt her throat tighten, though she managed to keep her voice steady. "You've become very good with words, Ethan. Guess I learned from you," he said lightly, and they both laughed. When they returned home, the sun was setting. Julia invited him for dinner, and they cooked together. Something simple, pasta and salad, just like the old days. It felt easy, natural, like they'd done it 100 times before. As they sat at the table, Ethan said quietly, "Do you ever regret anything?" Julia thought for a moment. "I used to, but now, not really. Every mistake, every loss, it brought me here, to now. I think that's what life is. Not about being perfect, but about finding peace with what's left." He nodded, thoughtful. "You make it sound so simple." "It isn't," she said with a smile. "But it's worth it." When he left later that night, Julia walked him to the door again. This time, the goodbye felt different. Not sad, not uncertain, but calm. He turned before leaving and said, "You know, when I met you, I didn't expect you'd change the way I see life." She smiled softly. "And you didn't expect I'd say the same about you." They both laughed quietly. A moment of shared understanding between two souls who had met at the right time. After he left, Julia went back to her desk. She opened her laptop and began rewriting parts of her book, adding a new chapter inspired by what she had just lived. It wasn't about love in the traditional sense. It was about connection, the kind that transcends age or circumstance. She titled the new chapter, "The Visitor Who Stayed Without Staying." Over the next few months, Julia's book was published by a small local press. It didn't make her famous, but it made her proud. She began giving small readings at the library, meeting people who told her words had helped them heal. Each time someone thanked her, she thought of Ethan, the one who reminded her that life could still surprise her. One evening, months later, she received a postcard from Seattle. It was a photograph of a sunrise over the city skyline. On the back, in Ethan's handwriting, were 3 words: "Keep shining, Julia." She smiled, placed the postcard beside her laptop, and whispered, "Always." Years later, when Emily visited for the holidays, she found the book her mother had written. She flipped through it and read the dedication on the first page. "For the person who reminded me that life begins again when someone believes in you." "Who's it for?" Emily asked curiously. Julia smiled, her eyes distant but peaceful. "A friend. Someone who showed up when I needed to remember who I was." That night, as Julia sat by the window watching the stars, she thought about how life had come full circle. She wasn't the same woman who once felt forgotten. She had rediscovered herself through kindness, through connection, through the quiet reminder that even the smallest encounters can change everything. The house was silent, but not empty. It was alive with the echoes of laughter, memories, and words that had once filled the air. And as the wind brushed against the window pane, Julia felt something she hadn't in years, a deep, unshakable peace. She closed her eyes and smiled, knowing that some goodbyes are not endings but beginnings in disguise. And though Ethan was miles away, she knew their stories would always be connected to souls who met in passing, yet left a mark on each other's lives forever. Because sometimes the most beautiful love stories aren't the ones that last forever. They're the ones that make you believe in life again.